So this video will cover the cardiac cycle and the cardiac conducting system section of the cardiovascular system and cardiovascular disease part of the second unit. So if you don't understand the heart structure and how to label them and know what each of the parts is, then you'll need to go back and look at the previous video, which will cover heart structure. Because without that basic knowledge, this becomes really, really complex. So for this, what you'll need to be able to do is initially label the structures in the heart. Okay, so I'm going to do them as shortened ones just for this. So this is the right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. And you'll need to know the blood vessels as well, but for the main part that we'll need to know just now are the valves and which ones these are. So these valves here are your AV valves, okay? And the other valves up here are your semilunar valves, and I'll come back to these when I talk about the different parts of the cardiac cycle. So cardiac cycle basically is just how to achieve one full beat of a heart. So you would have a period of contraction and a period of relaxation. So when you have one full beat of the heart, you would include two parts that are contracting and then one part of relaxation. So the first part of the contraction would be the atrial, what's called systole, and then ventricular systole, and then the last one would be diastole. Now sometimes these are called systole and diastole. Whichever way you pronounce it, it really makes no difference as long as you understand what happens with them. So initially what's going to happen is your heart will have to contract to squeeze blood from the atria into the ventricles. So that is atrial systole. So one would be the first part of this, which is atrial systole. Now in atrial systole, your atria are the things that would contract, because systole means contraction. Now when these atria do contract and they squeeze, the walls will squeeze in, and that blood will then be forced due to pressure down through these valves and into the ventricles. Now when that happens, you need to be able to describe which valves open and which valves shut. So these valves here are the AV valves. So during atrial systole, the AV valves would open to allow blood to move from the atria down into the ventricles on each side. Now because one valve says open and that allows blood to come down here, what you don't want is blood coming from these arteries and flowing back down. So these valves, are the semilunar valves. They would have to close and stay closed. So the SL valves would close. Now the second part of this process then would be the ventricular systole. So the ventricles then would have to squeeze. Okay, and by squeeze I mean contract. So systole just means contraction. So contraction specifically of those ventricles. Now when these ventricles squeeze, they're going to force blood up into those arteries. And that's the same for each side. So when that blood is forced up and through these valves, those valves need to open. So in ventricular systole, these valves are the ones that open now. So these are the semilunar valves. So the SL valves are the ones that open. Now because the SL valves are open, you don't want when the ventricles squeeze for that blood to be forced up into the atria again. So these AV valves need to close. So when one set of valves is open, the other must be closed. Now the very last part of the process then is what's called diastole. And that basically just means relaxation of the heart. So there's a point where it contracts and there's a point where it relaxes. So the whole heart would relax in this part. It wouldn't just be atrial diastole, it would be the whole heart. Now what happens in diastole is that the blood from the atria, just due to gravity, will trickle down into the ventricles. So it flows down just due to gravity. Okay, and that would do that through those atrioventricular valves, those AV valves. Now what happens is when the heart is relaxing, the pressure in those arteries will try and force blood back down, again due to gravity as well, okay, and due to high pressure up here. So these SL valves would need to be closed at this point. Okay, so that is one whole cardiac cycle, one whole beat of a heart. So atria contract, atrial systole, where the AV valves open and the SL valves close. Then the ventricles do the same thing, they contract, the SL valves open and the AV valves close. And then the heart relaxes during diastole. Now you can detect the sounds of these valves by using what's called a stethoscope. Now you've probably seen those and you'll know what I'm talking about. The things that go into your ears when you put it on someone's chest. So that stethoscope then will hear the sounds of the valves. Now specifically it's not the valves opening, it's actually the valves closing. So when they slam shut, that makes that lubbed up noise that you hear. So the atrioventricular ones will be the lub, and then the semilunar ones will be the dub. So they shut, then they shut, then they shut, then they shut. Okay, over and over again. Now, you have to understand the cardiac cycle and how the contraction works to then understand how the cardiac conducting system will allow the heart to beat. So I'm going to move on and do the next part, which will be the cardiac conducting system. You've probably heard of conducting before in terms of electricity, and that is exactly what happens with this. So with the cardiac conducting system, you will actually involve electricity. And this electricity will be in the form of electrical impulses. So anything that I've got that's a blue arrow would be an electrical impulse. Okay, so I'm going to describe the process of this, but first I'm going to label some key structures. So this, if you think about your heart again, would be the right side. This would be the left. So therefore this is the right atrium. Okay, left atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle. Now in your heart, you have a section in it, which is essentially just a big bundle of nerves and cells. And that area is called the Sinoatrial Node. Okay, which is often shortened to the SAN. And absolutely just stick to calling it the SAN, that's totally fine to shorten it. The SAN is sometimes called the pacemaker. Okay, and it's called the pacemaker because it sets the rate at which the heart contracts. So similar to when people get an artificial pacemaker, it does the same thing. Now, this sinoatrial node is composed of what's called autorhythmic cells. And what that means is those cells will just tell the heart to beat in a rhythmic manner, right, over and over and over again, just continuously at a set pace. Okay, so this SAN will regulate or not necessarily regulate, but will set the rate at the heart contracting. Okay, you also have another node, which is also on the right-hand side of the heart, but this time it's in the central part of the heart, right in the centre, in between an atria and a ventricle. And that's why this one is called your atrioventricular node. Now if you think about the AV valves, atrioventricular valves, they're shortened to AV. So the atrioventricular node can also be shortened to the AVN. So for the process of this, when this whole thing works, what you'll then need to be able to do is describe it. So when your heart contracts, it's because impulses are sent from the SAN. Now there's a specific process in how that works. Okay, so your SAN will send impulses that will pass across the atria. So electrical impulses, like I said here. So those will pass right from the SAN, right the way across these atria. Now when a muscle has electrical impulses passing over it, what happens is the muscle contracts. Okay, so that's what I've just shown here. So impulses from the SAN will pass across those atria, right here, and that will cause atrial systole. So basically what that means is the atria contract, like we talked about, and then those AV valves open to allow the blood to go from the atria into the ventricles. Now then what happens is these impulses also then pass to your AVN, which is the next node. Now what happens then is that AVN will basically pass those impulses down the central wall of the heart in fibres that run down them, and then those impulses will pass up the walls of the ventricles. Now when that happens, and there's electrical impulses that pass through those muscles, that will cause the ventricles to squeeze and to contract, and that causes ventricular systole. So the AV valves close then, and the semilunar valves open. And then what will happen is the heart then relaxes again. So there's a period of time when there's not contraction and not electrical impulses, and the heart will relax, and that'll be your diastole. So you need to link those parts into the cardiac cycle from before and know what diastole and what atrial systole and ventricular systole are, and relate that to the opening and closing of the valves. Now from National 5 you'll also know that the brain is involved in regulating the heart rate, and that's what's called the nervous control of the heartbeat. So there's a particular part of the brain that is involved in this. So if you think about structure of the heart, this here would be your medulla. And from National 5 you know that that is the part that will control the heartbeat or the heart rate, controls breathing rate and other stuff like that as well. Now that medulla will regulate the rate of that SAN, and it will cause it to increase or decrease. And it does that by using what's called the autonomic nervous system, which is one branch of your nervous system that will carry out what's called automatic responses. So things like your heart rate, breathing rate, other things that you do automatically without thinking about. So the ANS, which is the autonomic nervous system, has two branches of it. Now one branch is called the sympathetic, and the other branch is called the parasympathetic, and they work what's called antagonistically. So they work by antagonistic action, which is opposing action. So one does one thing and the other does the opposite action. So one nerve, which is your sympathetic nerve, will speed up the heart rate by causing this SAN to send more impulses over a period of time. Now it does that by producing something called noradrenaline, which is a neurotransmitter that nerve produces that causes the SAN to pulse more in terms of electrical impulses. Okay, so your sympathetic nerve produces noradrenaline, which increases the rate. Then you have another nerve that links to your autonomic nervous system, which is called your parasympathetic nerve. Now if you think about this, these work opposing, right? They have opposing action. So the sympathetic one will speed up, the parasympathetic one will decrease the rate, it will slow it down. So therefore that will decrease it through a chemical called acetylcholine. In an essay question you could be asked to describe this whole process, including atrial systole and what that means and the valves that open. And then the second part of the essay question could ask about nervous control. So this is where you want to talk about the medulla and what it does, and then the autonomic nervous system being antagonistic in its action. Okay, so that would be your nervous control. Now for your conducting system on its own, without the nervous control part, you want to talk about the SAN and what the purpose of that is. So it sets the rate. And then talk about the impulses causing atrial systole or systole. And then going from the SAN to the AVN and causing ventricular systole when it passes up the walls of those ventricles. And then talking about diastole being that final stage before it starts again. Right, so that's been the cardiac conducting system linked to the cardiac cycle. What I'm going to do for the next video is talk about the ECG, which is how to then show this process but in a reading, essentially on a graph.